Item SCP-637. Object Class Safe. Special Containment Procedures. When inactive, SCP-637 is contained entirely within the consciousness of SCP-637-2. SCP-637-2 is to be held at Site-17 in a low-security room. Anything it requests is to be given, as long as it does not violate standard procedure. However, any requests for pencils, pens, sketchpads, or any marking implement are to be denied and reported to Dr. Dot. The issue has been raised that if SCP-637-2 wanted marking devices, it could use a fluid such as blood or urine, but the subject has not displayed a marked interest in drawing. It is agreed, however, that it is wise not to tempt fate. Subject is to be fed 3 times per day and whenever it requests food. Description: SCP-637-2 is an elderly Caucasian woman of approximately 65 years of age, who calls herself Margie. Margie has been described by staff as polite and old lady-ish, if a little confused. She spends much of her time in a semi-catatonic state with occasional lapses of lucidity. SCP-637-2 is the host of SCP-637, a psychic organism which subsists entirely in SCP-637-2's mind. SCP-637 is described by its host as a little black cat, skinny fellow, real easygoing. Although the creature normally resides in a blank space in a subject's mind, it is capable of residing for several minutes as a drawn item on paper, wood, or other substance. If any sapient organism not previously carrying SCP-637 sees the reproduction, the image will vanish, and SCP-637 will take up residence in the new subject's mind. Based on information gathered from SCP-637-2 and D-67308, see Document 637-A, the organism behaves exactly as a normal cat, and its host is always capable of describing what it is currently doing and where it is within their head. SCP-637-2 shows affection for the theoretical creature. SCP-637-2 does not recall where she saw SCP-637 originally, so it is assumed to have been living in her mind for some time.